In the quiet suburbs of Pine Ridge, a police cruiser's lights flash against rain-slicked streets as Sarah Chen is pushed into the back seat. The officers think they've found an easy mark. Just another vulnerable young woman to add to their list of wrongful arrests and shakedowns. They don't know that Sarah's father, Marcus Chen, earned his Silver Star not just for his combat heroics, but for dismantling corruption in military ranks during his final deployment before losing his sight. They have no idea that the phone call she's about to make will set in motion events that will shake their department to its core. This isn't just another story about police corruption. This is about how a group of badge-heavy officers discovered that true power isn't found in a uniform or behind a gun. It's in the networks of justice that veterans build during their years of service. When they targeted Marcus Chen's daughter, they didn't realize they were about to face off against a man who had spent 20 years fighting systemic abuse in war zones across 3 continents. What follows is the story of how one blind veteran would expose an entire network of corrupt officers in just 72 hours, using nothing but his daughter's wit, his old military connections, and the same tactical brilliance that once made him a legend in military intelligence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen's morning routine always began with the sound of her father's cane tapping against the hardwood floors of their modest Pine Ridge home. Even after 15 years of blindness, Marcus Chen navigated their 2-story colonial with a grace that reminded her of his military days. The aroma of his signature garlic fried rice filled the kitchen, a recipe he'd perfected by touch and smell alone, refusing to let his disability diminish the breakfast tradition he'd maintained since Sarah's childhood. "Your coffee's getting cold, butterfly," Marcus called out, using the nickname he'd given her when she was 5. The pet name had stuck after she'd spent an entire summer chasing monarchs in their backyard, reporting their colors to her father in vivid detail. Now at 28, Sarah still smiled at the endearment, even as she rushed through their morning routine, her legal aid workload growing heavier by the day. The kitchen was their sanctuary, a space where father and daughter maintained their unbreakable bond. Marcus had redesigned it himself after losing his sight, installing tactical strips and perfectly positioned appliances. Every morning, they shared updates about their lives over breakfast, their conversations flowing effortlessly between English and Mandarin, a way of keeping their heritage alive while building their American dream. "Another tough case?" Marcus asked, his unseeing eyes somehow always finding her face. Years of military intelligence had given him an uncanny ability to read people's emotions through their voices, their movements, even their breathing patterns. Sarah sighed, pushing away a case file she'd been reviewing. The Martinez family, single mother, 3 kids. The police conducted an illegal search, planted evidence, and now she's facing charges that could separate her from her children. It's the 4th case this month with the same pattern. Marcus's fingers drummed against his coffee mug, a habit from his days analyzing intelligence reports. "Sergeant Wade and Officer Barrett?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of deeper understanding. "How did you—" Sarah started, then caught herself. Her father might have lost his sight, but his network of contacts throughout Pine Ridge remained sharp as ever. Veterans working as security guards, shop owners, taxi drivers, they were his eyes and ears, keeping him informed about the city's pulse. "Their names come up in certain circles," Marcus said carefully. "Old friends mention patterns. Complaints that disappear, witnesses who suddenly go silent." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Be careful, butterfly. Some people don't like it when you shine light in dark corners." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing her father's hand. "That's exactly why we can't look away. You taught me that. All those stories about your unit, about standing up against corruption even within the ranks. How can I do any less?" A proud smile crossed Marcus's face, though concern lingered in the set of his jaw. He'd raised Sarah alone after her mother's death, channeling his military discipline into creating a stable home life. His silver star and multiple commendations gathered dust in a drawer, but the principles that earned them, integrity, justice, protecting the vulnerable, those he'd passed on to his daughter. Their morning ritual concluded with Sarah guiding her father's fingers over her face, an intimate gesture that began after he lost his sight. "Let me see you," he would say, and through touch he would read her expression, checking for signs of stress or worry that her voice might hide. As Sarah gathered her files and prepared to leave for the legal aid office, Marcus stood in their doorway, his cane planted firmly beside him. "Remember what I always say, the strongest weapon is the truth," Sarah finished, kissing his cheek. "And the best armor is having people you trust at your back." She didn't know it then, but those words would become her lifeline in the hours ahead. As she drove to work in her used Honda Civic, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her father's military instincts had picked up on something she hadn't yet seen. The darkness lurking in Pine Ridge's corners was about to step into the light, and the Chen family would find themselves at the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. Sergeant James Wade sat in his cruiser outside Rosa's diner, watching the morning crowd through mirrored sunglasses. 20 years on the force had taught him which businesses needed extra protection, and Rosa's was due for its monthly reminder. The cash envelope she'd slip into his jacket pocket would join the others in his growing collection, protection money from scared immigrants who'd learned not to ask questions. "Got movement at Chen's office." Officer Barrett's voice crackled through his radio. The younger cop had been Wade's protege for 3 years, learning the delicate art of what they called community management. Really, it was a system of intimidation and profit that had worked flawlessly until Sarah Chen started poking around. Wade took a slow sip of coffee, watching Rosa nervously glance his way through the diner window. "Follow her. I want to know. Every file she touches, every client she meets. That girl's becoming a problem." Barrett's cruiser trailed Sarah's Honda at a distance as she made her way through Pine Ridge's working-class neighborhoods. The area was a gold mine for officers who knew how to work the system. Undocumented residents who wouldn't file complaints, small business owners who understood the value of police friendship, and enough drug traffic to keep everyone paid. And quiet. Back at the station, Wade's office was a testament to his influence. Commendations lined the walls, newspaper clippings praised his community outreach, and a photo showed him shaking hands with the mayor. Nobody questioned how a sergeant on a civil servant's salary afforded his lake house or his son's private school tuition. The thin blue line held firm. "She's meeting with the Martinez family," Barrett reported. "Third time this week, bringing in some senior legal aid guy too." Wade's jaw tightened. The Martinez case was supposed to be simple. A planted bag, a terrified mother, and another property seized for their partners in the developer's office. But Sarah Chen had started building a pattern, connecting cases that were meant to stay separate. "Time to remind her how things work in Pine Ridge," Wade decided, reaching for his phone. One call to Judge Matthews would ensure any evidence Sarah filed disappeared into administrative limbo. Another to their friends at the tax office would trigger an audit of the legal aid center's funding. Officer Barrett watched Sarah through his windshield, remembering Wade's first lesson. In this town, power isn't about the badge. It's about knowing which hands to grease and which throats to squeeze. The system worked because everyone played their part. Cops, judges, bureaucrats, all taking their cut and keeping their mouths shut. But Sarah Chen wasn't playing by those rules. She was building files, gathering testimonies, creating connections that threatened the whole machine. Worse, she was giving people hope, making them think they could stand up to the badge. "She's not backing down," Barrett observed, watching Sarah escort Mrs. Martinez and her children into the legal aid office. "Maybe we should let me worry about the Chen girl," Wade cut him off. "You focus on keeping our other friends happy. Can't have anyone else getting ideas about speaking up." The morning briefing room filled with officers, most of them knowing their role in the ecosystem Wade had built. They'd learned to look the other way, to lose dashcam footage when needed, to understand which arrests were by the book and which followed Wade's special playbook. But Sarah Chen was threatening to expose it all. Her legal aid work was creating a paper trail, documenting patterns that were meant to stay hidden in the shadows of Pine Ridge's corrupt system. Wade watched through the station window as his officers headed out for their shifts, each carrying instructions that would never appear in any official report. "Time to remind everyone who runs this town," he muttered, reaching for his badge. The weight of it had long since stopped representing justice. Now it was simply power, the power to take what he wanted, to crush anyone who resisted, to maintain the profitable peace he'd built in Pine Ridge. What Wade didn't realize was that his carefully constructed system was about to face something more formidable than a determined young lawyer. The network of corruption he'd built was extensive, but it was about to collide with another network, one forged in combat zones and strengthened by bonds of honor that money couldn't buy. Sarah's desk at Pine Ridge Legal Aid disappeared under mounting case files, each folder a story of lives derailed by badge-heavy officers. Her laptop screen glowed with a spreadsheet she'd been building for months. Dates, officers involved, patterns of behavior that couldn't be coincidental. The Martinez case had been the tipping point, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Her colleagues had warned her about digging too deep. "Some cases aren't meant to be won," her supervisor had said, closing his office door. "Sometimes winning means keeping your clients out of worse trouble." But Sarah couldn't forget her father's words about shining light in dark corners. At home, Marcus noticed the change in his daughter's movements, the hesitation before leaving for work, the late-night pacing in her room. His military training had taught him to read environments, to sense when tension was building toward inevitable conflict. The air in Pine Ridge crackled with that familiar electricity. "They're following me," Sarah finally admitted one evening, her voice tight with frustration. She stood at their kitchen window, watching a police cruiser roll past for the third time that hour, not even trying to hide it anymore. Marcus's cane tapped thoughtfully against the floor. "Tell me everything," he said, his tactical mind already mapping the terrain of their situation. Sarah laid out her investigation. The pattern of arrests in immigrant neighborhoods, the seized properties that ended up in developers' hands, the witnesses pressured into silence. "I've documented everything," she explained, pulling out her encrypted hard drive. "Evidence logs that don't match police reports, body cam footage that mysteriously disappears, property seizures that violate. Every procedure in the book. It's not just a few bad officers, Dad. It's systematic." Marcus nodded, his unseeing eyes focused on middle distance as he processed the information. "You've built your case carefully," he observed, "but they won't let you file it without a fight." Sarah's laptop pinged with an email alert, another client, another story of police overreach. This time, it was the owner of a small grocery store, his security cameras mysteriously malfunctioning just before officers found drugs in his storeroom. The pattern was becoming clearer, bolder, more brazen. "I can't back down," Sarah said, her voice finding strength. "Mrs. Martinez's children cry themselves to sleep every night. Mr. Patel lost his business of 20 years. The Ramirez family was forced out of their home. Someone has to stand up." Marcus moved to his daughter's side, his hand finding her shoulder with practiced ease. "You're right," he said softly. "But standing up doesn't mean standing alone." His fingers traced the outline of his old military sat phone, kept charged out of habit. "There are people who need to know what's happening here." That night, Sarah worked late at the office, cross-referencing cases, building her documentation. The police cruiser remained parked across the street, its occupants watching as she gathered the evidence that threatened their corrupt empire. She knew she was pushing them toward a response, forcing their hand. What they didn't know was that Sarah had already prepared for their inevitable retaliation. Every document was backed up, every piece of evidence secured in multiple locations. She'd learned from her father's military stories. Always have contingency plans. Always protect your intelligence. As she drove home that night, watching the cruiser follow at a distance, Sarah felt the weight of her father's dog tags against her chest. His gift to her when she started at legal aid. "Remember," he'd said, pressing the metal into her palm, "sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to call in reinforcements." The next morning would bring the confrontation they all knew was coming, but while Sergeant Wade and his officers prepared to teach Sarah Chen a lesson about power in Pine Ridge, they didn't realize they were about to trigger a response that would shake their corrupt foundation to its core. The morning sun hadn't yet broken through Pine Ridge's autumn fog when Sarah spotted the cruiser in her rearview mirror. She'd taken a different route to work, cutting through the old warehouse district. A test to confirm what she already knew. They weren't just following her anymore. They were hunting. Officer Barrett's voice crackled through his loudspeaker. "Pull over to the side of the road." Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her father's military training echoing in her mind. Stay calm. Control your breathing. Think 3 moves ahead. She pulled over, perfectly positioned beneath a traffic camera she knew was part of the city's newer surveillance network. Her dashcam was running, her phone already recording audio, every move calculated, just as her father had taught her. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, Sergeant Wade emerging from a second cruiser that had silently pulled up behind. "Oh, them." Sarah noted the absence of body cameras on both officers, the first break in protocol. "Is there a problem, Officer Barrett?" Her voice was steady, each word clear for the recording. She saw Wade's eye twitch at her use of Barrett's name. Another small victory in the psychological game they were playing. "Step out of the vehicle, Ms. Chen." Wade's voice carried the false patience of a predator sure of its prey. "We have reason to believe you're transporting illegal substances." Sarah's heart pounded, but her movements remained deliberate as she stepped out. "I do not consent to any searches of my vehicle or person. I am invoking my right to remain silent and requesting my attorney be present for any questioning." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how this works, not today." He nodded to Barrett, who moved to the car. The younger officer made a show of discovering a small bag of white powder under the driver's seat, planted so obviously that they wanted her to know it was fake. Well, Wade drawled, holding up the bag. "Looks like someone's been carrying more than just legal briefs." His next words carried the weight of every threat he'd ever made good on. "Shame what this will do to your career, your clients, your father's reputation." Sarah felt cold steel close around her wrists, but it was the mention of her father that sent ice through her veins. Still, she kept her composure, turning slightly to ensure the traffic camera caught her clear lack of resistance. "You have the right to remain silent," Barrett began, but Wade cut him off with a laugh. "She knows her rights. Been quite the problem, teaching them to people who should know better." He leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Time to learn how things really work in Pine Ridge." They didn't search her, their first mistake. The phone in her pocket was still recording, still broadcasting through an app her father's tech-savvy veteran friends had modified. More importantly, they hadn't taken her second phone, the one strapped to her ankle, loaded with a single number. In the back of the cruiser, Sarah waited until they turned onto Monroe Street, away from the traffic cameras. Wade was already on his radio, no doubt calling ahead to ensure she'd be processed without the usual booking photos or paperwork. Standard procedure for their special arrests. With practiced precision, Sarah twisted her leg up, using the loose fabric of her pants to access the phone. One press of the emergency button sent a pre-written text, "Uncle Jim, Protocol Sierra." 3 words that would activate a network of veterans, lawyers, and watchdogs her father had spent years cultivating. Wade's voice drifted back from the front seat. "Maybe a few days in holding will adjust your attitude about poking into police business." He had no idea that Sarah's arrest was about to trigger a response that would tear his corrupt empire apart. The holding cell they put her in was isolated, tucked away from the regular booking area. No cameras, no processing paperwork, no phone call, exactly as they'd done with their other victims. But Sarah wasn't like their other victims. She was the daughter of Marcus Chen, and she just activated a protocol designed by one of the military's finest tactical minds. "Comfortable?" Wade asked, peering through the cell bars. "You should be. Going to be here a while unless you decide to be reasonable about those files you've been collecting." Sarah met his gaze steadily, remembering her father's words about moments of crisis. Sometimes victory looks like defeat to those who don't know they've already lost. Somewhere across town, her message was already reaching the right people. The next few hours would teach Sergeant Wade and his corrupt officers a harsh lesson about underestimating their opponents. As Wade's footsteps echoed away, Sarah settled onto the hard bench, counting the minutes. The protocol her father had designed was already in motion. By now, Uncle Jim, her father's former commanding officer and current federal judge, would be making calls. Legal aid lawyers would be filing emergency motions. Veterans stationed throughout Pine Ridge would be activating their own surveillance networks. The game Wade thought he was playing was about to become something else entirely. He thought he was teaching Sarah Chen a lesson about power. Instead, he was about to learn one himself, about the kind of power that couldn't be bought with bribes or enforced with badges. The power of a network built on honor, loyalty, and the unshakable bonds forged in combat. Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing just as her father had taught her. The next 72 hours would change Pine Ridge forever. All she had to do was wait. Federal Judge James "Iron Jim" Morrison was reviewing case files when the text alert lit up his secure phone. His weathered face hardened at the 3 words on the screen. Uncle Jim. Protocol Sierra. Within seconds, he was reaching for a different phone, one that hadn't been used since his Special Forces days. "Marcus," he spoke into the encrypted line, "they've moved on Sarah." The blind veteran's response was calm, measured, the same tone he'd used during their most dangerous missions. "Understood. Activating the network now." Across Pine Ridge, a carefully orchestrated response began to unfold. At the local VA office, Thomas Rivera, former Marine Corps intelligence officer, casually stepped away from his desk. Within minutes, he'd accessed traffic camera feeds covering every approach to the police station. In his 20 years of service, he'd never left a fellow soldier's family behind. At the Pine Ridge Chronicle, veteran-turned-journalist Mike Taylor received a simple text: "Time to run that story." The exposé on police corruption he'd been building, with Sarah's help, had been waiting for exactly this moment. His fingers flew across the keyboard, adding the final pieces about her arrest. "Got eyes on the station," came a message from Sam Wong, a former Army Ranger who now ran a coffee cart outside the courthouse. His strategic position had provided invaluable intelligence over the past months, tracking the comings and goings of Wade's corrupt officers. In his home office, Marcus Chen sat at a specially designed computer station, his fingers moving across a braille display. Years of military intelligence work had taught him to create systems he could operate without sight. "Report positions," he commanded into his headset. The responses came in rapid succession. "Delta team in place at north entrance. Charlie monitoring back exits. Echo unit tracking Wade's vehicle. Bravo standing by at evidence lockup." They weren't just veterans. They were a carefully positioned network of citizens that Marcus had spent years cultivating. Shop owners, taxi drivers, courthouse clerks, all of them connected by their service and their commitment to justice. Judge Morrison's voice crackled through the secure channel. "Legal team is moving. I've got 3 federal warrants ready to sign. Just need the evidence Sarah collected." "Already ahead of you, Jim," Marcus replied, his fingers dancing across his keyboard. Sarah's dead man switch activated when they took her phone. Everything she documented is being uploaded to secure servers now. Wade's people won't be able to bury this one. In a small diner across from the police station, retired Master Sergeant Maria Ortiz watched Barrett enter with his usual swagger. She'd been documenting his protection racket for months, noting every business owner who paid up and everyone who suffered the consequences of refusal. Her coffee cup hid a high-resolution camera catching every interaction. Target is moving. There came a whisper over the network. Wade's cruiser was heading toward his usual meeting spot, a storage facility on the edge of town. What he didn't know was that every unit around his had been rented by veterans over the past year, each one equipped with surveillance equipment that would make the CIA envious. Marcus's hands stilled on his keyboard as he absorbed the incoming information. Sarah had played her part perfectly, appearing vulnerable while actually springing the trap. Now it was time for the next phase. "All units, execute Operation Daybreak," he commanded. The response was immediate and unified. Dozens of veterans moving into position, each one carrying out their assigned role in dismantling Wade's corrupt empire. Judge Morrison allowed himself a grim smile as he signed the first warrant. 20 years ago, he and Marcus had taken down a corrupt military contractor in Baghdad. Now they were about to do the same to a corrupt police sergeant in Pine Ridge. Some battles, he reflected, never really ended. They just changed locations. "Remember," Marcus's voice carried across the network, "we do this by the book. Everything documented, everything legal. We're not just taking them down, we're making sure they stay down." The pieces were in place. The next move would be Wade's, but he'd already lost the game. He just didn't know it yet. Detective Maria Santos stared at the wall of her cramped internal affairs office, where 3 years of investigation into Pine Ridge Police Department was mapped out in meticulous detail. Red strings connected photos of Sergeant Wade to various incidents, each one suspicious, but never quite enough for an arrest. Until now. Her phone buzzed, a text from her FBI contact. "Chen girl in custody." Wade made his move. Santos had been waiting for this mistake. For months, she'd watched Sarah Chen building her case, recognizing a kindred spirit in the young lawyer's methodical approach to exposing corruption. "They didn't even process her," Officer Rodriguez whispered, slipping into Santos's office. As one of the few clean cops left in narcotics, Rodriguez had been her eyes inside Wade's operation. "They took her straight to the ghost cells in Section D," Santos nodded, pulling out a thick file labeled Pattern and Practice. "Just like the others, except this time we've got it all on camera." She revealed several screens showing footage from micro cameras she'd managed to plant throughout the station. Wade's arrogance had made him sloppy. He never thought internal affairs would dare surveil their own station. "There's something else," Rodriguez added, glancing nervously at the door. "The veterans are moving. I've never seen anything like it. Every coffee shop, newsstand and taxi around the station suddenly has a former military operator in it. They're watching us watch them." Santos smiled for the first time in days. The pieces were falling into place. Wade thinks he's fighting a legal aid lawyer. He has no idea he's up against a military intelligence network. She pulled up Sarah's file, which included a detailed background on Marcus Chen and his former unit. These aren't just veterans. They're specialists in counterintelligence and corruption investigations. Her office phone rang, a secure line connected directly to the FBI task force. "Detective Santos," the familiar voice of Agent Cooper came through. "Your patience is about to pay off. Judge Morrison just called in some markers. Federal warrants are being prepared." Santos looked at her wall of evidence. 3 years of careful documentation, witness statements that never quite felt safe enough to come forward, financial records showing suspicious patterns. "Send them to me. All of it needs to go to a judge. Wade's going to try to make the Chen evidence disappear, but he can't disappear a federal investigation." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "Wade's got half the brass in his pocket, even with federal warrants." "He's got the brass, but we've got something better," Santos interrupted, pulling up surveillance photos of Wade's recent meetings. "We've got every transaction, every payoff, every dirty deal he's made in the last 3 years. And now, thanks to Sarah Chen, we've got the civilian complaints to back it all up." Her computer pinged with an incoming file. Marcus Chen's military record, most of it redacted. But what wasn't blacked out told a story of a man who had specialized in rooting out corruption in war zones. Wade picked the wrong family to target, she muttered. Santos gathered her files, checking her weapon and badge. Time to move, Rodriguez. Get your people in position. When Wade realizes he's been outplayed, he's going to try to destroy evidence. We need to be ready. As she stepped out of her office, Santos felt the weight of 3 years of investigation coming to a head. In the lobby, she noticed new faces. A janitor she'd never seen before, checking his watch. A delivery man scanning the room with too much precision to be civilian. The veterans weren't just watching, they were preparing for their own operation. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. Detective Santos. Marcus Chen sends his regards. Perhaps we should coordinate our efforts. She smiled, realizing that while she'd been watching Wade, the veterans had been watching everyone, including her. The game was changing. What had started as her solo investigation into police corruption was about to become something much bigger. Wade and his corrupt officers were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between having power and having real allies. News of Sarah Chen's arrest spread through Pine Ridge's immigrant communities like wildfire. Mrs. Martinez was the first to act, her hands trembling as she dialed the number Sarah had given her just in case. Within hours, her small restaurant became an impromptu command center for the community's response. She helped my son fight deportation, Mr. Patel said, standing among the growing crowd of Sarah's former clients. When Wade's officers planted evidence in my store, she was the only one who believed me. His security camera footage, which Sarah had carefully backed up, was already being uploaded to multiple news outlets. Rosa, whose diner had suffered under Wade's protection racket, started organizing her fellow business owners. No more payments, she declared, her voice finding strength in numbers. Sarah showed us the law. They can't touch us if we stand together. Outside the police station, a different kind of protest was taking shape. Veterans who'd never revealed their military background began appearing in strategic locations. A homeless man everyone had ignored for months shed his ragged appearance, revealing himself as former Special Forces operator Dave Martinez. His cardboard sign, which had seemed like nonsense, was actually a sophisticated surveillance log of police movements. The community's mobilizing faster than expected, he reported through a concealed comm unit. Wade's losing control of the narrative. Inside the station's holding area, Sarah could hear the growing commotion outside. More importantly, she noticed the changing behavior of the desk officers. Their usual confidence was cracking as reports came in of widespread resistance to their authority. Local journalist Mike Taylor's article hit the Pine Ridge Chronicle's website. Legal aid lawyer arrested after exposing pattern of police corruption. The story included dozens of testimonials from community members, each one carefully collected and verified over months of preparation. The police scanner channels crackled with increasing panic. We've got crowds gathering at multiple locations, an officer reported. These aren't random protesters, they're organized. They know our procedures, our weak spots. Wade burst into the holding area, his face flushed with anger. What did you do? He demanded, but Sarah merely smiled. She didn't need to explain that every act of corruption he'd committed had built this moment, creating a network of witnesses ready to testify. At the legal aid office, Sarah's colleagues were executing. They're part of the plan. We've got signed affidavits from 37 victims, Maria Gonzalez announced, transmitting the documents to Judge Morrison's office. All notarized, all following proper procedure. Wade can't claim this is just one person's vendetta. The Veterans Network monitored the growing civil resistance with professional approval. Marcus Chen's voice came through their secure channel. The community is doing exactly what Sarah prepared them for. Wade's facing a legal insurgency and he doesn't even know it. Outside Rosa's restaurant, community leaders from different neighborhoods gathered to coordinate their response. Mrs. Martinez, now a confident spokesperson, addressed the media. Sarah Chen taught us our rights. She showed us how to document everything, how to protect ourselves legally. Now we're using what she taught us. The Pine Ridge Police Department's phones were overwhelmed with calls from citizens filing formal complaints, each one following the exact procedures Sarah had outlined in her Know Your Rights workshops. Every call was recorded, every complaint logged, creating an avalanche of paperwork that couldn't be easily buried. They're not just protesting, Detective Santos observed from her office. They're conducting a coordinated legal assault on Wade's entire system. Chen taught them to fight corruption with paperwork and procedures. As night fell, the community's response continued to grow. Food trucks appeared to feed the protesters, all owned by veterans, all positioned to maintain surveillance. Legal aid lawyers moved through the crowds, collecting statements and ensuring everything remained peaceful and documented. Wade's empire was facing something he'd never anticipated, an uprising that followed every rule, documented every violation, and left no legal loophole for escape. Sarah's arrest hadn't silenced the community. It had triggered the response she'd spent months preparing them for. In Marcus Chen's home office, the air hummed with focused intensity. His fingers moved across his braille display, while veteran tech specialist Jenny Torres converted surveillance data into audio patterns he could interpret. 20 years of working without sight had taught him to build perfect mental maps from sound and touch. Wade's empire has 3 pressure points, Marcus analyzed, his tactical mind reconstructing the corrupt network: financial trails, evidence storage, and his command structure. We hit all 3 simultaneously. Former forensic accountant turned veteran advocate Derek Mitchell had already infiltrated Pine Ridge's property records. Wade's smart with his money, but his partners aren't. Found shell companies linking seized properties to development deals. Judge Morrison can freeze these assets with one signature. Focus on Officer Barrett, Marcus directed. Young, ambitious, but sloppy. Pull his financial records first. The data flowing through their secure network painted a damning picture. Barrett's rookie salary somehow supported a boat, gambling trips, and expensive tastes. Every transaction left a trail that Jenny's algorithms were now connecting to specific police operations. Got something? Sam Wong's voice crackled through their comms from his coffee cart position. Barrett just made 3 calls from the station's west entrance. He's spooked. Marcus's hands moved across his keyboard, his muscle memory flawless. Track those numbers. Barrett's our weak link. Under pressure, he'll reach out to everyone involved. Each call leads us to another conspirator. In her surveillance van, Maria, Ortiz monitored the police radio frequencies. Wade's calling in favors, trying to get judges on the phone, but they're not answering. Word's out that the feds are watching? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. In war, he'd learned that corruption networks were strongest when everything worked, but collapsed quickly when pressured at multiple points. How's our evidence collection? Better than good, Torres reported. Sarah's dead man switch didn't just dump data to our servers, it activated dormant programs in the police department's network. Everything they try to delete gets backed up automatically. Wade's digital fingerprints are all over the cover-ups. The Veterans Network had positioned assets throughout Pine Ridge's infrastructure. A janitor at City Hall was photographing documents. A parking attendant tracked officer movements. A food truck vendor recorded conversations. Each piece of intelligence flowed back to Marcus's command center, building an irrefutable case. Barrett's making mistakes, Derek reported. Just tried to access his offshore account from a department computer. Amateur hour. Marcus's fingers traced a pattern only he could see. He's following Wade's playbook, but without Wade's connections. Cross-reference his account activity with our list of seized properties. The correlation was immediate. Barrett's deposits aligned perfectly with Wade's property seizures. But more importantly, his panicked attempts to hide the money were revealing. The entire network of corrupt officials, dirty lawyers, and complicit developers. Wade made a critical error, Marcus observed. He built his empire on fear and greed, but fear makes people sloppy, and greed leaves trails. Through their surveillance, they watched Wade's support system crumbling. Corrupt judges suddenly became unavailable. Police brass developed scheduling conflicts. Even the usual media allies were keeping their distance, sensing the changing winds. One more thing, Torres added. Found Barrett's personal cloud storage. He kept photos. Insurance, he probably thought. But now they're evidence against everyone involved. Marcus nodded, his military training recognizing the pattern. In every corrupt system he dismantled, there was always someone who kept receipts. Someone who wanted leverage, just in case. Barrett had just provided them with the final pieces they needed. "Send everything to Judge Morrison and Detective Santos," Marcus commanded. "It's time to tighten the noose." Wade thought he was untouchable because he controlled the system, but he forgot the first rule of tactical warfare. No system is stronger than its weakest link. The Veterans Network continued its relentless data collection, each piece of evidence another nail in Wade's coffin. They weren't just building a case. They were dismantling his entire power structure, piece by piece, using his own methods against him. Mike Taylor sat in the Pine Ridge Chronicle's conference room, surrounded by evidence that would have seemed overwhelming just days ago. But now, with Sarah Chen's meticulous documentation serving as a roadmap, the veteran-turned-journalist saw the perfect story taking shape. "We're going live in all formats," his editor announced, scanning the documents spread across the table. "Print, digital, social media. Taylor, your military background is about to pay off. You're the only one who can tell this story right." Across the town, Detective Santos was building her own coalition. Clean officers who had stayed silent for years were finally stepping forward, their testimonies filling gaps in the investigation. Officer Rodriguez had orchestrated a quiet meeting in the basement of St. Michael's Church, where a dozen cops sat in the pews, ready to break the blue wall of silence. What Wade and Barrett did to Sarah Chen, "It's happening today because we let it happen yesterday," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying in the sacred space. "How many times did we look the other way? How many citizens did we fail to protect?" The church's pastor, Father Mackenzie, himself a former military chaplain, stood at the back, ensuring their security. His years counseling veterans had made him a trusted figure in both the military and law enforcement communities. Now his church was becoming a sanctuary for truth-tellers. At the local VA office, Thomas Rivera had transformed the recreation room into an intelligence hub. Veterans who had been watching Wade's operation for months shared their observations with Detective Santos's team. Years of military surveillance experience merged with traditional police work, creating a comprehensive picture of the corruption. "We've got movement," a voice crackled through the secure channel. Sam Wong, still at his coffee cart, watched as Barrett rushed from the station to his car. "He's carrying files. Looks like evidence destruction is starting." Santos smiled grimly. "Let him run. Every camera in the city is watching. Every move he makes builds our case." In the Pine Ridge Chronicle's newsroom, Mike Taylor's story was taking final shape. His military training had taught him to recognize patterns, to see the bigger picture. The article wasn't just about corrupt cops. It was about a community rising up, about veterans protecting civilians, about justice finding its way through unexpected channels. "Lead with the human stories," Marcus Chen's voice advised through Taylor's earpiece. "Mrs. Martinez, Mr. Patel, Rosa's diner. Show how Wade's corruption hurt real people. Then show how Sarah connected them, gave them hope." Community leaders gathered at Rosa's diner, now a de facto command center for civilian resistance. Mrs. Martinez, who had once been too afraid to speak up, was organizing other families affected by Wade's corruption. Mr. Patel shared security footage that showed officers planting evidence. Rosa displayed years of detailed records documenting protection payments. Sarah taught us to keep records, Rosa explained to Taylor. She said documents tell stories that can't be silenced. Detective Santos moved between these various groups, weaving their evidence into her official investigation. The veterans provided tactical expertise and surveillance. Community members offered testimonies and documentation. Clean cops contributed insider knowledge. Journalists ensured the story couldn't be buried. This is how you dismantle corruption, Marcus observed from his command center. Not with one big blow, but with 1,000 small cuts. Every witness, every document, every photo chips away at their foundation. As night fell over Pine Ridge, these disparate allies coordinated their next moves. Taylor's expose would hit. At dawn, Santos's official reports would land on federal desks. The veterans' surveillance network would track any attempts at retaliation. The community stood ready to protest, document, and resist. Wade's power had always depended on isolation, keeping his victims afraid and alone. But Sarah Chen had spent months building bridges, connecting people who thought they were powerless. Now those connections were becoming Wade's undoing. Sergeant Wade paced his office like a caged animal, phone pressed to his ear, each call meeting the same response: unavailable, unreachable, or worst of all, silence. His carefully cultivated network of influence was dissolving in real time. "Get me Judge Matthews," he barked at Barrett, who looked increasingly pale. "He owes us. He can shut this down." "Judge Matthews isn't taking calls," Barrett replied, his voice cracking. "His clerk says he's recusing himself from all pending matters." "They all are, Wade. Every judge we've worked with is going dark." Wade slammed his fist into the desk, sending files scattering. Outside his office window, he could see more protesters gathering, but these weren't ordinary demonstrators. Their movements were too coordinated, their positions too tactical. "Break into the legal aid office," he ordered. "Destroy everything. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong." But even as he gave the command, Wade noticed Barrett's hesitation. "What?" "It's already been hit," Barrett admitted. "But not how you think. Some crew went in last night, professionals. They didn't take anything. They just copied everything. Every file, every computer, every piece of evidence Sarah Chen collected. It's all been duplicated." The implications hit Wade like a physical blow. They weren't just facing exposure. They were being systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly how to do it. His phone buzzed with an alert from his bank. Access denied. Another buzz. Second account frozen. Third, each offshore nest, egg he'd carefully hidden, was being locked down by federal authorities. "The veterans," Wade muttered, finally understanding. "Chen's father, his whole network. They're not just watching us. They've been setting this up for months." In desperation, Wade reached out to his media contacts. The local news stations that had always buried stories of police misconduct were suddenly following editorial guidelines. The reporters he'd paid off were pursuing other leads. "Sir," Barrett interrupted, looking at his phone, "someone just sent me these." He held up his screen, showing photos of every payoff, every planted evidence scene, every corrupt deal they'd ever made. "They've been watching us. All along, they've been documenting everything." Wade grabbed his keys. "The evidence locker. We need to—" He stopped as Barrett shook his head, already cleaned out. "Official federal evidence team came in an hour ago with warrants. They knew exactly where to look, what to take, like they had a map." Outside, the veteran surveillance network tracked Wade's every move. His phone calls were monitored, his digital footprints traced, his attempts at damage control documented and counted before they could take effect. "Getting desperate," observed Sam Wong from his coffee cart position. "Wade's called every contact in his phone in the last hour. No one's answering." In the holding cells, Sarah Chen heard the increasing panic in the officers' voices. Her father had taught her that corruption, once exposed to light, could never rebuild its shadows. Wade made one final attempt, approaching Sarah's cell. "We can make a deal," he offered, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever you want. Name your—" "Our price," Sarah smiled, the same calm smile her father wore when victory was assured. "You still think this is about money," she said softly. "You still don't understand what you're really fighting." As if in response, Wade's phone lit up with a message. Photos of his lake house, his son's private school tuition payments, his offshore accounts, all traced back to seized property. Sales and protection money. The message came from an unknown number. "The truth doesn't take bribes, Sergeant Wade." Barrett, watching his boss unravel, made his own decision. Without a word, he walked out of the station, heading straight for Detective Santos's office. Self-preservation had always been his strongest instinct, and he could read the writing on the wall. Wade stood alone in his office, watching his world collapse. Every weapon in his arsenal, intimidation, bribery, political connection, was being systematically neutralized. The power he'd built through fear was being dismantled by something stronger, a network built on honor, duty, and the unshakable bonds of military brotherhood. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from an unknown number. "Check the Pine Ridge Chronicle's website in 1 hour. Your move, Sergeant." Detective Santos stared at the evidence spread across her desk, her coffee growing cold as the pieces finally clicked into place. Barrett's confession had revealed something far darker than routine police corruption. What started as an investigation into Wade's protection racket had just blown wide open into something that would shake Pine Ridge to its core. "Play that footage again," she instructed Torres, who had brought the surveillance tapes from the Veterans Network. The video showed Police Chief Richard Harrison in a late-night meeting at the port, shaking hands with a man Santos immediately recognized from DEA bulletins. Carlo Vasquez, lieutenant of the Sinaloa cartel's Pacific Northwest operation. Marcus Chen's voice came through the secure line, his tactical assessment cutting straight to the heart of the revelation. The property seizures, the targeted arrests, the protected neighborhoods. It wasn't just about money, they were clearing territory for cartel distribution networks. In the church basement, Officer Rodriguez laid out a map marking every property seized under Wade's operation. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone with narcotics experience. "They weren't random shakedowns," he explained to the gathered clean cops. "They were systematically clearing distribution routes, pushing out local dealers, creating protected corridors for cartel product." Sarah, still in her cell, heard the change in the station's energy. Officers were rushing through hallways, shredders, working overtime, phones ringing unanswered. Something big had spooked the entire command structure. Chief Harrison burst into Wade's office, his usual polished demeanor cracking. "They found the containers," he hissed. "FBI's moving on the port." "How did they—" He stopped, finally noticing the recording light on Wade's laptop camera, its feed streaming directly to Marcus Chen's command center. The evidence mounted by the minute. Barrett's offshore accounts linked directly to shell companies, owned by cartel front operations. The timing of police raids perfectly matched the cartel's shipment schedule. Every piece of documentation Sarah had collected about civil rights violations now revealed a deeper pattern: the systematic displacement of anyone who might interfere with the cartel's expansion. "This goes higher than Harrison," Judge Morrison realized, reviewing federal warrant applications. DEA's been tracking cartel money flowing into City Hall, the mayor's office, even the state attorney general's campaign funds. In Marcus's command center, Jenny Torres's algorithms pieced together years of financial data. "The whole operation is genius in its simplicity," she explained. "Use police corruption as cover for cartel expansion. Who's going to look twice at crooked cops running protection rackets when they're actually setting up one of the largest drug corridors on the West Coast?" Wade, watching his security empire crumble, finally understood his true position. He'd never been the mastermind he'd imagined. He was just middle management, a disposable asset in a much larger criminal enterprise. Chief Harrison had chosen him precisely because of his greed and ambition, qualities that made him effective but ultimately controllable. Sarah's strategic, Arrest had done more than expose police corruption. It had triggered a cascade of revelations that threatened the entire cartel operation. Her meticulous documentation of civil rights violations had inadvertently mapped the cartel's entire distribution network. The cartel won't let this exposure stand, Marcus warned through the secure channel. They'll try to clean house, eliminate everyone who can testify. As if confirming his assessment, reports came in of unmarked vehicles moving through Pine Ridge, cartel cleaners preparing to silence potential witnesses. Detective Santos mobilized her task force. Get protective details on Barrett, Wade, and every officer who's flipped. Chief Harrison's not just running from prosecution, he's running for his life. The Veterans Network shifted into high alert, their military training recognizing a familiar pattern. This wasn't just about corrupt cops anymore. They were now facing a sophisticated criminal organization with billions at stake and a history of brutal reprisals. In the holding cells, Sarah heard heavy footsteps approaching. Through the bars, she saw Officer Rodriguez running toward her, keys in hand. "We need to move you," he said urgently. "They're not just dirty cops. These people, they make Wade look like a Boy Scout." The revelation changed everything. What started as a fight against local police corruption had just become a war against one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. And Sarah Chen, a legal aid lawyer who simply wanted to protect her community, now held evidence that could bring down not just a corrupt police department, but an entire cartel operation that reached into the highest levels of state government. Marcus's voice crackled through the secure channel, addressing the entire network. "New protocol, effective immediately. We're no longer just fighting corruption, we're at war with the cartel, and they just realized we've caught them with their pants down." Marcus Chen's command center had transformed from a corruption investigation hub into a war room. Veterans who had once tracked dirty cops now mapped cartel movements, their military training shifting seamlessly to counter narcotics operations. 4. Clean extraction routes, Marcus directed, his fingers reading tactical overlays on his braille display. "Sarah's our primary asset. She needs to reach federal custody with her evidence intact. The cartel will try to prevent that at all costs." Jenny Torres's voice cut through the operational chatter. "Thermal imaging shows 3 vehicles circling the station. Professional crews, military-style movements. They're waiting for someone to move Sarah." Marcus's hands never stopped moving across his computer setup. Years of military intelligence had taught him to think in multiple dimensions. "They're expecting a police transport, so we don't use one. Time to call in our ghost assets." Across Pine Ridge, seemingly ordinary businesses began their transformation. A flower delivery service van, actually owned by a former Navy SEAL, moved into position. A taxi company run by ex-Special Forces operators activated their backup protocols. Even the local senior citizens shuttle bus, driven by a retired Army Ranger, stood ready. "Detective Santos," Marcus spoke into his secure line, "your task force needs to create a very visible preparation for prisoner transport. Make it loud, make it obvious. Let them focus on your movements." Santos understood immediately. "A decoy operation. While they're watching us, we move Sarah through channels." "They won't expect," Marcus confirmed. "But first, we need to secure the evidence, all of it." In the VA office's makeshift command post, Thomas Rivera coordinated with a network of veteran-owned businesses. Every shop with a security camera, every dashboard cam, every cell phone. "I want everything uploaded to secure servers." The cartel. "You can't destroy what they can't find." Judge Morrison's voice joined the strategic session. "Federal warrants are ready, but timing is crucial. We hit every location simultaneously. Police station, port facilities, Chief Harrison's office, Wade's storage units. One coordinated strike." Marcus processed the tactical information flowing through his systems. "The cartel will have cleanup. Crews standing by at every location. We need to neutralize their ability to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses." "What about Wade?" Santos asked. He's scared enough to talk, but the cartel knows that too. Wade's not our primary concern, Marcus replied. Barrett's already talking, and he knows more than Wade ever did. Focus on the chief. Harrison's the link between the cartel and City Hall. Jenny's algorithms flagged new movement. Port Authority cameras show increased activity. They're trying to move something out before the warrants drop. Marcus's fingers danced across his keyboard, coordinating. Their response. Judge Morrison, we need those port warrants now. Detective Santos, get your harbor units ready. They'll try to scatter their assets once they realize we've rolled up their police protection. The strategy took shape with military precision. Each veteran in the network received their updated assignments. Surveillance positions shifted to cover potential escape routes. Safe houses were prepared for witnesses who would need protection. Sarah's evidence is the key, Marcus reminded them. Everything she documented, every pattern she identified, it maps the cartel's entire operation. That's why they're willing to risk exposing themselves to silence her. We protect that evidence at all costs. The next hour would determine everything. If they moved too soon, the cartel would scatter. Too late, and crucial evidence would disappear. Marcus felt the familiar tension of operational planning, the weight of lives hanging on strategic decisions. One more thing, he added, his voice carrying the authority of countless successful missions. The cartel doesn't know they're facing veterans. They think they're dealing with cops and lawyers. That's our advantage. We fight this on our terms, not theirs. The pieces were in place. The network was ready. What had started as a mission to protect his daughter had evolved into something much larger. A chance to free Pine Ridge from both corruption and cartel influence in one decisive operation. Marcus's final command was simple: execute Operation Daybreak and bring my daughter home. Night fell over Pine Ridge as the Veterans Network made their final moves. Sam Wong closed his coffee cart for the last time, revealing the surveillance equipment hidden beneath its cheerful exterior. The homeless veteran outside the station shed his ragged coat, checking the body armor underneath. Rosa's diner transformed into a forward operating base, its kitchen staff replaced by operators who could serve coffee while monitoring cartel movements. Safe House Network is green, Jenny Torres reported from her station beside Marcus. Medical teams on standby at each location. Dr. Mitchell's got 3 trauma units ready if things go sideways. Detective Santos gathered her trusted officers in the church basement one final time. Once we move, there's no going back. The cartel will recognize a coordinated attack. They'll respond with everything they have. She looked at each face, seeing determination replace fear. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we don't stop until every piece of evidence is secured. In the police station holding cells, Officer Rodriguez made his final rounds, carefully checking Sarah's cell while appearing to conduct routine procedures. Package is secure, he whispered into his concealed comm unit, ready for extraction on signal. Outside the port, 3 unmarked vans filled with former Special Forces operators took up strategic positions. Their leader, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who now ran a local security firm, watched thermal imaging of cartel guards through a modified scope. Count 12 tangos on the perimeter. Professional setup. These aren't street thugs. Marcus's fingers moved across his tactical display as final confirmations came in. Each piece of the operation had to move in perfect synchronization. "Status report," he commanded. The responses flowed in. "Harbor patrol in position. Federal task force standing by. Surveillance network active. Media teams prepped with evidence packages. Medical units ready. Extraction routes cleared." Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of authority. "Final warrants signed and registered. All operations are legally cleared to proceed." In her cell, Sarah felt the change in the station's atmosphere. The usual night shift routines had altered subtly, different footsteps, modified patrol patterns. Her father's training helped her recognize the signs of imminent action. At the port, Chief Harrison personally supervised the loading of containers onto a waiting ship, his phone buzzing constantly with updates from increasingly nervous associates. The cartel's cleanup crews waited in shadows, their presence a clear signal that this was no ordinary police operation. Wade sat in his office, staring at photos of his lake house, his family, all the trappings of power he'd accumulated. On his desk lay 2 phones, one from the cartel demanding he handle the situation, another from Detective Santos offering witness protection. Time was running out to choose. Marcus made his final checks, his military experience telling him these quiet moments before action were crucial. Every operator knew their role. Every contingency had been planned for. The network of veterans, cops, and community members was poised to reclaim their city. Remember? His voice reached every member of the operation. We're not just fighting corruption or cartels. We're fighting for every citizen who trusted the system and found it broken, for every person who thought they had to accept injustice as normal. Tonight, we show Pine Ridge what justice really looks like. The church bells struck midnight. In the darkness, dozens of veterans who had been hiding in plain sight prepared to reveal their true capabilities. The operation to free Sarah Chen was about to become a battle for the soul of Pine Ridge itself. Marcus's command was quiet but clear. All units, prepare to execute. Operation Daybreak commences in 10 minutes. At precisely midnight, Pine Ridge erupted in synchronized chaos. Detective Santos's task force breached the police station's front entrance, federal warrants raised high. At the same moment, a flower delivery van pulled up to the building's rear, its innocent appearance masking a team of former Navy SEALs. Federal agents, everyone on the ground. The command echoed through the station's corridors as stunned, corrupt officers found themselves facing both internal affairs and FBI tactical teams. Wade reached for his drawer, but froze as Officer Rodriguez's weapon trained on him. "Don't!" Rodriguez warned. "It's over." At the port, thermal imaging went dark as veterans cut power to the entire facility. Chief Harrison's phone died mid-call as signal jammers activated. In the darkness, cartel guards found themselves facing opponents they couldn't see, veterans who had mastered night operations in far deadlier environments. "Port secure," came the first report. 3 containers of evidence preserved. Cartel cleanup crew neutralized. The voice belonged to a former Marine who now worked as a longshoreman. His cover finally served. Sarah's cell door opened to reveal what appeared to be a maintenance worker. His uniform concealed tactical gear, his toolbox containing extracted hard drives from the station's servers. "Miss Chen," he whispered, "your father sends his regards. Time to move." Marcus coordinated the chaos from his command center, his fingers reading real-time updates through his braille display. "Team 2, redirect to the evidence locker. Cartel assets approaching from the east. Team 4, prepare for extraction." The senior shuttle bus, driven by the retired Army Ranger, pulled up to collect what appeared to be elderly passengers from the station. Each senior citizen was actually a federal agent, their walkers concealing evidence bags. Sarah, disguised, in a grey wig and shawl, shuffled among them. At City Hall, Judge Morrison's warrants unleashed a wave of federal agents through administrative offices. Servers were seized before they could be wiped. Documents were secured before shredders could spin up. The mayor himself found his phone and computer confiscated mid-deletion. "Package secure," Jenny reported as Sarah's evidence reached the first safe house. "Uploading to federal servers now. They can't bury this anymore." The cartel's response came swift and desperate. 3 black SUVs converged on the police station, but found themselves boxed in by suddenly broken-down vehicles, each one driven by a veteran who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Sir," Jenny's voice carried urgency, "Wade's making a move. He's accessed his private server." Marcus's hands flew across his keyboard. "Redirect to secondary protocol. Let him think he's deleting evidence. Every keystroke is being recorded and—" Backed up. Chief Harrison attempted to flee the port in the confusion, but found himself facing Maria Ortiz, the food truck vendor he'd ignored for months. Her stance revealed her military training as she held him at gunpoint. "Federal agent," she announced. "You should have checked who was really serving your coffee." The operation moved with precision, born from decades of combined military experience. Each veteran knew their role, each position supported the others, every contingency had been planned for. The cartel's enforcers found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by opponents who had perfected these tactics in actual war zones. "All primary targets secured," Santos reported. "Evidence preserved at all locations. Witness protection teams moving into position." Marcus allowed himself a small smile as the reports continued to flow in. The operation wasn't just successful, it was overwhelming. Wade's corruption, the cartel's influence, the city's complicity, all of it exposed and documented beyond any possibility of denial. "Sir," Jenny interrupted, "Sarah's team reports they've reached the federal courthouse. She's safe." Marcus nodded, his military discipline holding even in this moment of personal relief. "Maintain surveillance. The cartel will have backup plans. We hold positions until every piece of evidence is secured and every witness is safe." Pine Ridge shuddered under the impact of Operation Daybreak as justice finally pierced the darkness that had held the city hostage for so long. The federal courthouse buzzed with controlled chaos as Operation Daybreak entered its final phase. Sergeant Wade, Chief Harrison, and a parade of corrupt officials found themselves facing Judge Morrison in the same courtroom where they had once wielded their corrupt influence. "The evidence speaks for itself," Morrison declared, his military bearing evident even in judicial robes. "Systematic corruption, RICO violations, international drug trafficking. Bail is denied for all primary defendants." Wade stared in disbelief as his carefully constructed world crumbled. Through the courtroom windows, he watched his former officers being led into federal vehicles. Barrett had already turned state's evidence, his testimony filling the gaps in Sarah's documentation. "You don't understand what you've done, Chief." Harrison hissed at Sarah as federal marshals led him past. "The cartel won't let this stand. They'll what?" Detective Santos interrupted, stepping forward. "Your cartel friends are a bit busy right now. DEA's hitting their West Coast operations based on the evidence we seized. Turns out your little empire was the weak link they needed." In Marcus's command center, Jenny monitored the cartel's increasingly desperate communications. "They're burning. They're Pine Ridge connections. Local assets are being cut loose. Wade and Harrison just became toxic to their own organization." Sarah sat with her father in the courthouse's secure room, finally able to hold his hand after the long ordeal. "You had this planned all along, didn't you? From the moment I told you about the corruption." Marcus smiled, his unseeing eyes warm with pride. "I had the network ready. You did the hard part, building the case, connecting the dots, giving people the courage to stand up. I just provided the backup you needed." Outside, Pine Ridge was transforming. FBI teams swept through city offices, carting away boxes of evidence. Clean officers reclaimed their station, under Santos's watchful eye. The port, for the first time in years, operated without the shadow of cartel influence. "We've got movement." "At the state level," Judge Morrison reported, "Attorney General's office is launching investigations into 3 other cities. Pine Ridge was just the beginning. The veterans maintained their positions, watching for any last desperate moves from the cartel's remaining assets. But the criminal organization had already written off Pine Ridge as a lost cause. Their attention turned to protecting other operations from the expanding federal investigation. Wade, facing his booking procedure, finally understood the full scope of what had happened. "You weren't just after me," he said to Santos. "We were bait. You used our corruption to expose the entire cartel operation." "No," Santos corrected him. "Sarah Chen exposed you. We just helped justice find its way home." In the courthouse lobby, Mrs. Martinez hugged Sarah, tears in her eyes. "They're dropping all the false charges. Everyone you helped. We're all getting justice now." Marcus's network began its careful withdrawal. Veterans returning to their cover identities. The homeless vet resumed his post outside the station, now secretly coordinating witness protection. Sam's coffee cart reopened, still gathering intelligence. On the city's recovery, Operation Daybreak is complete, Marcus announced over the secure channel. But our work isn't done. Pine Ridge needs to heal. The system needs to be rebuilt. This time we do it right. Sarah watched through the courthouse windows as the sun rose over her city. The long night of corruption was over, but the dawn brought new challenges. Reform, restoration, rebuilding trust. These would be her next battles, fought not in shadows but in the light of day. The cartel's influence had been broken, Wade's corruption exposed, and Pine Ridge stood at the threshold of a new era. What had started as one lawyer's stand against injustice had become a template for fighting systemic corruption across the country. Ready to go home? Marcus asked his daughter, rising from his chair with practiced grace. Sarah nodded, knowing that home meant more than just their house. It meant a Pine Ridge where justice wasn't just a word on courthouse walls. It was a living reality, protected by an invisible network of veterans who had never forgotten their oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. 1 month after Operation Daybreak, Pine Ridge pulsed with the energy of renewal. The police department, under Detective Santos's interim leadership, underwent a complete restructuring. Officers who had stayed silent under Wade's regime now led anti-corruption training sessions, teaching their colleagues the importance of moral courage. Sarah Chen's legal aid office expanded, now operating from a larger building where Mrs. Martinez's story hung prominently on the wall, a reminder of how one person's stand against injustice could spark a revolution. Local business owners, freed from the burden of protection payments, contributed to a community legal defense fund. The veterans maintained their quiet presence, their network evolving from a tactical operation into a community watchdog group. Marcus Chen became an unofficial advisor to the Police Reform Commission, his military experience in fighting corruption proving invaluable in rebuilding institutional integrity. The real victory, Sarah told a community meeting, isn't just in what we stopped, but in what we started. Every citizen who speaks up now, every officer who chooses integrity over silence, that's how we prevent this from happening again. The Pine Ridge Chronicle's coverage of the corruption scandal won Mike Taylor a National Journalism Award. But more importantly, it restored the public's faith in the power of truth. His ongoing series about the city's transformation became required, reading in police academies across the country. As federal prosecutors worked through the mountain of evidence, Pine Ridge became a model for other cities fighting systemic corruption. The Veterans Network shared their expertise, teaching other communities how to recognize and resist the creeping influence of organized crime. The changes weren't just institutional. They lived in the renewed confidence of shopkeepers who no longer feared police visits, in the restored dignity of families who had reclaimed their unjustly seized properties, and in the strengthened bonds between citizens who had stood together against corruption. Marcus Chen's pride in his daughter grew with each passing day, as Sarah's legal work expanded from fighting individual cases to shaping policy. Together, they had shown Pine Ridge that true power lay not in badges or bribes, but in the courage to stand up for what was right and the wisdom to know you never had to stand alone. 6 months after Operation Daybreak, Marcus Chen sat in his familiar spot at Rosa's diner, his fingers tracing the braille on a newly installed plaque commemorating the community's stand against corruption. The diner had become more than just a gathering place. It was a symbol of Pine Ridge's transformation. Sarah's voice carried across the busy morning crowd as she discussed cases with her expanded legal team. The Legal Aid Office now operated a dedicated police accountability division, working collaboratively with Santos, newly promoted to Chief of Police, to ensure transparency and justice prevailed. The veterans remained vigilant, but less visible. Their network now focused on mentoring a new generation of community leaders. Their example had inspired other military veterans across the country to become more involved in local governance and community protection. Marcus smiled, listening to the sounds of his transformed city, the confident voices of business owners, the respectful interactions with patrol officers, the ongoing conversations about maintaining the hard-won peace. Pine Ridge had become something he'd fought for his entire military career, a place where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a daily reality. As father and daughter shared their morning coffee, they knew that while one chapter had ended, their work would continue. The light they had shined in Pine Ridge's dark corners would keep burning, passed on through the stories of courage, unity, and the unshakable bonds between those who chose to stand for what was right.